October 1982, the Panjshir Valley, Afghanistan. Dawn bleeds a pale, cold light over the Hindu Kush. The silence is a thin crust over the valley floor, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Then a low rumble fractures the stillness. A Soviet motorized rifle battalion, a mechanized snake of BTR-60s and BMP-1s, grinds its way along the riverbank road. Inside a command BTR, the air is thick with diesel fumes and tension. The map, spread across the commander's knees, shows a narrow valley flanked by contour lines stacked tight like ribs. It is a textbook Udanaya Gruppa, a shock group, the sharp tip of the deep battle spear designed to rupture a front and drive deep into the enemy's operational rear. But there is no front here. The lead vehicle rounds a bend. For a split second, the gunner in the turret sees a flicker of movement on the high ridge, 800 meters up. It is too late. A rocket-propelled grenade, fired from a cave mouth no map will ever show, traces a faint smoke trail downward. It strikes the lead BTR's thin side armor with a deafening crump. The vehicle lurches, smoke pouring from its hatches. Instantly, the valley walls erupt. Machine gun fire stitches the column from three directions. Heavy DSHK rounds, their sound a distinct thud, 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 punch through light armor. Mortar rounds walk down the road, trapping the convoy. The battalion commander barks orders into his radio, calling for pre-planned artillery fire. The coordinates are useless. The enemy is not in a trench line. He is the mountain itself. Hind gunships are summoned, but they wheel cautiously, knowing Stinger teams now haunt these heights. The deep battle plan, a masterpiece of synchronized timed advances, has met a force that does not hold ground to be ruptured. It dissolves into a desperate, bloody fight for a single kilometer of rock and dust. The theory of depth has collided with the reality of altitude, and it is breaking its teeth on the stone. The Soviet war machine, built to fight a linear, European war of mass and momentum, has been lured into a trap that its own doctrine cannot comprehend. And while its generals study maps of Germany, an entire generation of American officers is watching, learning, and drafting a new kind of warfare designed to render this obsolete nightmare irrelevant. To understand the scale of the failure in that Panjshir ambush, one must first appreciate the towering intellectual edifice it was meant to represent. The Soviet doctrine of deep battle, or Glubokaya Operatsiya, was not merely a set of tactics. It was a grand operational theory, a symphony of destruction composed for the industrial age. Its roots lay in the bloody lessons of the First World War and the Russian Civil War, where static fronts had led to catastrophic slaughter. In the 1920s and 1930s, visionary Soviet military theorists like Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Vladimir Triandafilov sought an answer. Their solution was operational art, the level of warfare between tactics and strategy. Deep Battle proposed the simultaneous assault of an enemy's entire tactical depth. It was a doctrine of paralyzing shock. The goal was not to push the enemy back, but to annihilate his command, control, and logistics from the outset, creating windows of opportunity for exploitation. The methodology was precise and brutal. A Udanaya Gruppa, shock group, would concentrate overwhelming force, artillery, armor, and close air support on a narrow sector of the enemy's front to achieve a breakthrough. Simultaneously, Podvizhnaya Gruppa, mobile groups, often tank or mechanized formations, would pour through the rupture. Their mission was not to engage in protracted fights, but to drive deep into the enemy's operational rear, 50 to 100 kilometers, seizing key command nodes, logistics hubs, and communication centers. Paratroopers or air-mobile troops would be dropped even further behind lines to sow chaos. The entire process was meticulously timed, reliant on centralized command, pre-planned fire schedules, and the relentless momentum of mass. The doctrine was forged in the fire of the Eastern Front of World War II. Operations like Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 were its masterpiece. Here, Soviet forces didn't just defeat the German Army Group Center, they dismantled it. Deep strikes by armored mobile groups encircled and destroyed entire armies, advancing over 600 kilometers in 2 months. Speed, depth, and the psychological collapse of the enemy's operational system were the keys to victory. By 1945, Deep Battle, honed by unimaginable sacrifice, had proven itself against the finest army in the world. It became the sacred text of the Soviet armed forces, the unassailable formula for winning the next great war, a war everyone assumed would be fought on the plains of Central Europe against NATO. But victory contained the seeds of dogma. In the decades following 1945, the Soviet military-industrial complex perfected the tools of deep battle, but fossilized its thinking. The doctrine became a rigid, top-down blueprint. Initiative was stifled in favor of strict adherence to the plan. Junior officers were trained to execute, not to adapt. The army optimized itself for a single apocalyptic scenario: a massive, high-tempo armoured clash along the inner German border, where nuclear pre-strikes might pave the way for armoured avalanches. This European focus was total. Every piece of equipment, from the T-72 tank to the BMP infantry fighting vehicle, was designed for that environment: flat terrain, dense road networks, and a recognizable enemy force structure. When the Politburo made the decision to intervene in Afghanistan in December 1979, it was seen not as a war but as a limited contingency operation. The mission was political: stabilize the fracturing communist government in Kabul. Military planners viewed it through the narrow lens of their doctrine. They deployed a Vysadka, an air landing operation, to seize key points in Kabul, a classic deep battle opening move. The initial invasion was swift and clinically executed. But this was not a maneuver against a modern army. This was the entry into a vast medieval labyrinth of mountains, deserts, and tribal loyalties. The enemy, the Mujahideen, possessed no operational rear to strike. Their command nodes were village shuras and mountain caves. Their logistics were camel trains and smugglers' paths. Their strategy was not to hold ground, but to survive, harass, and bleed the invader. The Soviet 40th Army marched into Afghanistan equipped with a doctrine for breaking front lines, but it had crossed a threshold into a war without fronts. The very concepts of deep and rear lost all meaning in a country where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, and where the terrain itself was a hostile force. The stage was set for a decade-long collision between a doctrine of industrial-age mass and a reality of timeless, asymmetric resistance. The initial Soviet deployment into Afghanistan was, on its surface, a textbook display of operational shock. On December 24, 1979, the air bridges opened. Massive An-22 and Il-76 transports began a relentless shuttle into Kabul and Bagram airfields. They disgorged elements of the 103rd Guards Airborne Division and the 345th Independent Parachute Regiment. Simultaneously, ground forces of the 40th Army, primarily the 201st and 360th Motorized Rifle Divisions, rolled across the pontoon bridges over the Amu Darya River at Termes. Their advance was rapid, meeting no conventional military resistance. By December 27th, the Vishka operation was in its final phase. Soviet Spetsnaz and paratroopers stormed the Tajbek Palace, killing President Hafizullah Amin. A puppet government under Babrak Karmal was installed. From a deep battle perspective, the initial objectives were secured. Key political and communication centers were in hand, and the opposing state's military was neutralized. The Politburo and the General Staff in Moscow believed the revolutionary situation would now be consolidated. The 40th Army would garrison key cities and lines of communication, providing a stabilizing internationalist shield while the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan (DRA) Army rebuilt and asserted control. This was a catastrophic misreading of the Afghan reality. The DRA Army, riven by desertion and sympathy for the rebellion, was a broken instrument, and the Mujahideen were not a conventional enemy to be stabilized against. They were a hydra of hundreds of independent tribal and ideological groups united only by a common goal: the expulsion of the communist infidel and his foreign patrons. Their sanctuary was not a geographical rear area, but the impregnable mountain ranges of the Hindu Kush and the porous 3,500-mile border with Pakistan, where the Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI) Directorate and the CIA were beginning to channel global jihadist fervor and modern weaponry. The Soviet military found itself in a counterinsurgency coin conflict for which it had no doctrine, no training, and critically, no institutional appetite. Deep battle required identifiable enemy formations and infrastructure to target. In Afghanistan, the primary target was the population's loyalty, and the infrastructure was centuries-old irrigation ditches, karez, and mountain trails. The environment was merciless. The thin air of high altitudes robbed helicopters and ground attack jets of performance and payload. The dust-choked summers and bone-breaking winters ravaged sensitive equipment. The complex terrain shattered unit cohesion and line-of-sight communications, rendering the centralized time-on-target orchestration of deep battle impossible. An artillery barrage that could obliterate a grid square in Germany was useless against a sniper team that had already moved to another ridge. By 1982, the war had settled into a brutal stalemate. The Soviet military responded not with doctrinal innovation, but with the brute force application of its deep battle tools in a punitive, terror-based strategy. Large-scale, multi-division Panjshir offensives were launched against Ahmad Shah Massoud's stronghold. They would clear the valley in a massive display of firepower, only to have the Mujahideen filter back as soon as the troops withdrew to their garrisons. It was a grinding war of attrition against an elusive enemy, a colossal waste of the operational art the Soviets had mastered, while Soviet commanders in Kabul grappled with this insoluble puzzle. On the other side of the world, a rival military analysing these very failures was quietly constructing a new operational doctrine that would leapfrog an entire generation of warfare. For the Soviet soldier, the Afghanets, the grand theory of deep battle translated into a daily reality of terror, frustration, and grinding fatigue. The doctrine's requirement for secure lines of communication, LOC, made him a prisoner of the roads. His primary mission was not deep, decisive maneuver, but the guarding of those LOCs. Convoys snaking through the mountain passes were not spearheads, they were slow-moving, predictable targets. Every journey was a gauntlet. The lead vehicle in a column was a death sentence, tasked with triggering ambushes or pressure plate mines. Tactics devolved into a brutal, reactive pattern. Patrols ventured out from fortified bases, the zastavas, not to seize ground but to provoke contact, to find an enemy that controlled the clock. The Mujahideen dictated the terms of every engagement. They initiated ambushes at point-blank range from positions so elevated that Soviet vehicle armor was meaningless. The standard Soviet response, drilled into every officer, was to deploy into a defensive perimeter, fix the enemy with suppressive fire, and call in pre-planned artillery or air support. But in the mountains, fixing an enemy on a distant ridge was often impossible. By the time fire support coordinates were relayed up the chain of command and shells began to fall, the Mujahideen had already vanished, melting back into the landscape. This tactical paralysis bred deep psychological erosion. Initiative was punished by doctrine. Junior officers who attempted creative, small-unit adaptations risked censure for deviating from the plan. The soldier in the field saw the mismatch daily. His BTR's tires were shredded by cheap Chinese-made mines. His BMP's fuel-hungry engine ran dry on long patrols. His heavy, plated body armor was unbearable in the 120-degree heat. He fought an enemy who wore sandals and carried a rifle, a satellite radio, and a Stinger launcher. The deep in deep battle, for him, meant the deep sense of vulnerability in a valley where the enemy owned the high ground. It was a war of nerves where the constant, low-grade anxiety of the ambush was often more debilitating than the firefight itself. The human element, the very core of any army's will to fight, was being systematically drained in a conflict where their vaunted operational art had no answer. The Soviet war machine in Afghanistan was a system optimized for a different universe. Its technological and logistical architecture, the very engine of deep battle, became a crippling liability in the Hindu Kush. But this fist was clumsy. Soviet tube and rocket artillery were devastatingly effective in massed barrages against area targets. Against dispersed mobile guerrilla bands in complex terrain, they were profligate and inefficient. Firing missions required detailed planning, massive ammunition resupply convoys, themselves prime targets, and often resulted in the obliteration of empty hillsides or, tragically, villages that only fueled the insurgency. The armoured vehicles, the teeth of the mobile groups, were equally mismatched. The BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle, designed for high-speed advances in Europe, had thin aluminum armour that offered little protection against heavy machine guns or RPGs from above. Its low silhouette design became a death trap in mountainous ambushes, where fire came plunging down from cliffs. The mighty T-55 and T-62 tanks were road-bound behemoths in a country with few roads. Their long-range guns were useless in close-quarter defiles, and their underbellies were vulnerable to mines. Most critically, the Soviet system depended on air power for mobility, close support, and intelligence. The Mi-24 Hind gunship was the tyrannosaur of the battlefield, a symbol of Soviet might. But the introduction of the CIA-provided FIM-92 Stinger missile in late 1986 changed the ecosystem. The Stinger was a precision tool against a blunt instrument. With its infrared seeker and fire and forget capability, it gave a single mujahid the power to kill a multi-million-dollar aircraft from 3 miles away. Soviet air tactics were forced into a panicked adaptation. Helicopters now flew at higher, less effective altitudes. Attack runs became hesitant. The psychological burden on air crews soared. The secure airspace required for deep battle's air assault and deep strike components vanished. The technological asymmetry was reversed. Now it was the superpower that was vulnerable to the individual, precision-guided decision of a single fighter on a mountain ridge. The system's greatest strengths, mass, centralization, and heavy firepower, had been systematically neutralized by a combination of primitive terrain and advanced, democratized technology. While Soviet commanders grappled with a war their doctrine couldn't solve, the United States Army was undergoing its own profound crisis of identity. The trauma of Vietnam had shattered confidence in its own operational approach. The 1973 Yom Kippur War delivered a second shock. It showcased the devastating lethality of modern Soviet-style weapons, Saga anti-tank missiles, dense air defenses, and high-tempo armored warfare on a conventional battlefield. It was clear that if NATO faced the Warsaw Pact in Europe, the initial battles would be apocalyptic. S-Army's existing doctrine, active defense, was reactive and attritional, ceding the initiative to a numerically superior Soviet foe. It was a recipe for a bloody, losing delay. S-Army Training and Doctrine Command, TRADOC. Led by visionary generals like Don A. Starry and William E. Dupuy and later John W. Foss, a group of officers began to construct a new doctrine from first principles. They studied the Soviets deeply, not to mimic them, but to defeat them. They pored over the emerging lessons from Afghanistan, seeing the vulnerabilities of a rigid, centralized system. The result, formally adopted in 1982 with the publication of Field Manual, AFM, 100-5 Operations, was AirLand Battle. AirLand Battle was the antithesis of Soviet deep battle in philosophy, though it shared the goal of operational depth. It was a doctrine of initiative, agility, and decentralization. Where deep battle was a rigid, conductor-led symphony, AirLand Battle was designed as synchronized jazz. Its 4 tenets were clear: initiative, depth, agility, and synchronization. Initiative meant seizing and retaining the operational and tactical tempo, forcing the enemy to react. Depth involved striking the enemy simultaneously throughout the entire depth of his formation, not just at the front line, but against his reserves, command nodes, and logistics far to the rear. Agility was the mental and physical ability to act faster than the enemy. Critically, synchronization was not top-down control, but the arrangement of battlefield activities in time, space, and purpose to produce maximum relative combat power at the decisive point. It empowered junior leaders to make decisions within the framework of the commander's intent. Technologically, AirLand Battle was fused with a suite of emerging smart systems. The Assault Breaker program envisioned using long-range missiles and sensor-fused weapons to destroy second-echelon armored formations before they ever reached the front. The PAVE-TAC targeting pod allowed precision strikes deep behind enemy lines. Most importantly, the doctrine was built around the concept of the extended battlefield, leveraging every available asset — Air Force, Navy, space-based surveillance, and electronic warfare — in a fully integrated way. It was a system of systems approach designed to paralyze and then dismember the Soviet operational system by striking its brain, command and control, and its nervous system, communications and logistics, rendering its massive muscle, tank armies blind, deaf and immobile. The most damning critique of Soviet deep battle in Afghanistan was authored not by American theorists but by the Mujahideen. They became the living, breathing manifestation of a strategic paradox: how a low-technology, decentralized force can unravel a high-technology, centralized one. They were the ultimate unguided missile, operating on a simple, organic guidance system of faith, local knowledge, and mission-type orders. Their tactics were a masterclass in exploiting Soviet doctrinal rigidity. They understood that the Soviet system needed predictability to function, so they introduced chaos. Ambushes were never mere attacks. They were designed to trigger a predictable Soviet response, the call for fire support, the deployment into a defensive perimeter that would then be targeted by pre-registered mortar fire or further ambush teams. They attacked not to hold ground but to consume Soviet resources, to force the expenditure of costly artillery shells, to down a multi-million-dollar helicopter, to tie down battalions guarding a single pipeline or road. Their use of terrain was genius. Mountain passes became natural kill zones. Cave complexes expanded over centuries became impregnable logistics depots and hospitals immune to aerial bombardment. Their logistics, a nightmare for a conventional army, were a masterpiece of human-scale adaptation. A network of smugglers, mule trains and porters moved weapons from CIA, ISI depots in Pakistan along ancient caravan routes invisible from the air. The Stinger missile, once provided, was not integrated into a complex air defense network. It was given to a team with 2 weeks of training. Its effectiveness came from its simplicity and the decentralized decision of a single fighter to engage. For the Soviet 40th Army, the rear was the fragile line of the Salang Highway, perpetually under threat. For the Mujahideen, the rear was the entirety of Pakistan's northwest frontier province and the sympathy of the local population. They turned the Soviet strength, the need for massive, vulnerable logistics, into their primary target. Every burned fuel truck, every destroyed bridge was a direct attack on the Soviet system's ability to execute its own doctrine. In doing so, this seemingly primitive force validated the core premise of the rival American doctrine being written at that very moment: that future victory would belong to those who could see the entire battlefield as a system, and who possessed the agility to strike its critical, fragile nodes. The Mujahideen, unwittingly, were proving the concept of AirLand Battle's deep attack in the most visceral way possible. This convergence of Soviet stagnation and American innovation was brewing beneath the surface of the Cold War. The final bloody years of the Soviet-Afghan conflict would provide the last data points, and the stage was being set for a confrontation that would serve as the ultimate live-fire validation of this doctrinal revolution. The turning point was not a single battle, but a cascading series of realizations and events that stripped the Soviet military model of its aura of inevitability. The first and most profound was the Soviet Union's own admission of defeat. By 1986, under the policy of Glasnost, the true cost of the war in Afghanistan began to seep into the Soviet public consciousness. The returning Afghansi, the veterans, spoke of a mismanaged, brutal conflict. The army, the sacred institution of the state, was seen as bleeding for no clear purpose. The political will to continue evaporated. The military lessons were equally damning. The much-vaunted operational art had failed. The large-scale Panjshir offensives, the 5th, 6th, and 7th, had become expensive, repetitive rituals. They would clear the valley at great cost in men and material, only to have Ahmad Shah Massoud's forces return weeks later. The Soviet system could seize terrain, but it could not control it or secure the population. The Afghan war proved that an army optimized for high-intensity linear warfare could be rendered strategically impotent by a decentralized, agile enemy in complex terrain. The correlation of forces, a sacred Marxist-Leninist metric that quantified tanks, divisions and missiles, was meaningless against faith, topography and the Stinger missile. Analysts at the RAND Corporation, the CIA and within TRADOC dissected every lesson. Their conclusion was stark. The Soviet system was brittle. It was slow to adapt, vulnerable to attacks on its command and logistics, and could be paralyzed by the loss of initiative. The Mujahideen had done it with guerrilla tactics and man-portable technology. The question American planners asked was, what could a modern, networked military built on the principles of AirLand Battle do? The answer was being built in laboratories, workshops, and on training ranges across America and NATO. The 1980s witnessed a silent technological surge that was the physical manifestation of AirLand Battle theory. The Global Positioning System, GPS, initially a military project, began to provide global, all-weather navigation, ending the age of terrain association and map-reading errors for pilots and ground units. Stealth technology, embodied in the F-117 Nighthawk, promised to make deep strikes into enemy airspace not just possible, but undetectable. Precision-guided munitions, PGMs, like the laser-guided GBU and the electro-optical AGM-65 Maverick, evolved from rare curiosities to central elements of strike planning. They meant one plane with one bomb could now destroy what previously required a dozen aircraft carpet bombing an area. Most critically, a digital nervous system was being woven. The Joint Surveillance and Target Attack Radar System, JSTARS aircraft was developed, a flying command post that could see moving vehicles on the ground from hundreds of miles away, in real time, day or night. This was the ultimate tool for executing the deep attack against second echelon forces. Link 16 data links allowed aircraft, ships, and ground stations to share a single, common picture of the battlefield. This was the synchronization tenet of AirLand Battle made electronic. Military, creating a force that thought faster, saw farther, and struck with surgical precision. This doctrinal and technological evolution lacked only one thing: a real-world test against a competent, Soviet-style foe. The world did not have to wait long. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraqi Republic Guard, the fourth largest army in the world, modeled, trained and equipped by the Soviet Union, rolled across the border into Kuwait. In a matter of hours, they overran the tiny emirate. Saddam had built a classic Soviet deep battle army. Layered defenses, massive artillery parks, armored divisions held in operational reserve, and dense, integrated air defense systems. IADS. He had studied the same manuals. He believed in mass, fortification, and the attrition of any attacker. He presented the perfect target set. The stage was now set for the largest live-fire exercise in military history, a direct, head-to-head test between the fossilized Soviet model and the nascent American doctrine of AirLand Battle. The Iraqi occupation of Kuwait created a geopolitical and military tableau that seemed at first glance to favor the defender. Saddam Hussein's army deployed in a classic Soviet-style echelon defense across southern Kuwait and into Iraq itself. The first echelon, along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, the so-called Saddam Line, was a dense network of minefields, trench lines, barbed wire, and fortified strongpoints manned by infantry divisions. Its purpose was to fix, delay, and bleed an attacking force. Behind it, in operational depth, lay the armoured and mechanized divisions of the Republican Guard, T-72s, BMPs, and self-propelled artillery, the Udanaya Gruppe shock group meant to counterattack any NATO penetration and deliver a decisive blow. It was a textbook setup, a direct import of Soviet operational art designed for the defense of the Fulda Gap, now transplanted to the Arabian Desert. Central Command, CENTCOM, led by General Norman Schwarzkopf, this presented not a nightmare, but the exact scenario for which AirLand Battle had been crafted. The plan, Operation Desert Storm, would not be a head-on assault against the Saddam Line. That would play directly into the Iraqi and, by extension, the Soviet doctrinal playbook. Instead, the offensive was conceived as a single, enormous operational maneuver designed to shatter the enemy system. The AirLand Battle tenets were meticulously translated into phases. The depth tenet was executed first and most violently. At 2:38 a.m. Baghdad time on January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm commenced not with ground troops, but with a deep strike into the very heart of the Iraqi system. Stealth F-117s, invisible to Iraqi radars, slipped into Baghdad and destroyed key nodal points: the National Command Authority in the Air Defense Operations Center, ADOC, communication hubs and power generation facilities. Simultaneously, hundreds of coalition aircraft supported by overwhelming electronic warfare that blinded and deafened Iraqi defenses began the systematic annihilation of the Iraqi Air Force and its integrated air defense system, IADS. Within days, Iraqi airspace belonged to the coalition. The enemy's eyes were gone. For 38 days, the air campaign executed a relentless deep attack. Using real-time data from J-STARS and other surveillance platforms, coalition air power hunted the Iraqi army in its operational depth. Scud missile launchers, artillery parks, and most critically, the Republican Guard divisions waiting in reserve were attacked not as they moved, but in their assembly areas, supply depots, and dug-in positions. Bridges across the Euphrates and Tigris were severed, isolating the Kuwaiti Theatre of Operations, KTO, from reinforcement. This was the assault breaker concept brought to life. The second echelon was being destroyed before the first ground shot was fired. The synchronization of air, space, and information warfare created a paralyzing effect the Soviets termed maskirovka, deception, but on a scale and precision they had never imagined. When the ground offensive, Operation Desert Sabre, launched on February 24, 1991, it was not an attack, but a coup de grace. The Iraqi frontline infantry, bombed for weeks, demoralized and cut off, surrendered in droves. The main effort was not a frontal assault, but an enormous, sweeping left hook. S. The 68th Airborne Corps and 7 Corps, the equivalent of a massive combined arms Podvizhnaya Gruppa, raced hundreds of miles to the west, outflanking the entire Saddam line, and drove deep into Iraq before turning east to envelop the Republican Guard from the rear. They moved with a speed that overwhelmed Iraqi decision cycles. GPS guided them through featureless desert. Aerial reconnaissance provided constant updates. Close air support responded to calls in minutes, not hours. The climatic engagement occurred at Medina Ridge and the Battle of 73 Easting. armoured units, primarily M1A1 Abrams tanks and M2 Bradley fighting vehicles equipped with superior thermal sights that allowed them to see through the smoke and darkness of sandstorms, engaged dug-in Republican Guard T-72 formations. The results were catastrophic for the Iraqis. Soviet-built tanks were destroyed at ranges beyond their ability to effectively return fire. Their rounds harmlessly bounced off the Abrams advanced Chobham armor. The agility and initiative of American small unit commanders operating within the broader intent created local tactical victories that compounded into operational collapse. In 100 hours of ground combat, the Iraqi army and the KTO ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The Highway of Death, the gruesome image of the obliterated Iraqi convoy fleeing north, was not a battle, but a turkey shoot, the final disintegration of a system that had already been cognitively and physically destroyed. The turning point was now undeniable. The doctrine forged in the perceived lessons of Soviet failure in Afghanistan and honed against a Soviet-model army in the desert had achieved a victory of such stunning totality and low cost that it rendered an entire paradigm of warfare obsolete. The world watched as deep battle, the doctrine of the 20th century's most land-powerful empire, was not just defeated but made to look archaic and foolish by its conceptual successor. The baton of operational supremacy had been decisively and publicly passed. The smoke over the Kuwaiti desert had barely cleared before the true seismic scale of the event began to calcify into historical fact. Operation Desert Storm was not merely a battlefield victory. It was a systemic and psychological annihilation. The statistics told a story of almost incomprehensible imbalance. Coalition forces suffered approximately 300 battle deaths. Iraqi military losses are estimated between 20,000 and 50,000 killed, with 75,000 wounded and over 80,000 taken prisoner. Over 3,700 Iraqi tanks, 2,400 armoured vehicles and 2,600 artillery pieces were destroyed or captured. The vaunted Republican Guard, the regime's strategic reserve, lost over half its equipment and ceased to exist as effective formations. But the numbers only quantified a deeper truth, the complete inversion of the correlation of forces. For decades, NATO planning had been haunted by the Warsaw Pact's numerical superiority in tanks, troops, and artillery. Desert Storm demonstrated that those numbers were hollow if one side could see, think, and strike with orders of magnitude greater efficiency. and its allies had destroyed an army of nearly 1 million men in 6 weeks with a force half its size. The myth of Soviet military equivalence, already cracked by Afghanistan, was now shattered beyond repair. The psychological impact on the global stage, particularly in Moscow, was profound. Russian generals watched the footage of their exported equipment burning in the desert with a sense of professional horror. Their entire military paradigm, the product of a century of thought and sacrifice, had been rendered obsolete by a war they did not fight. The immediate strategic consequence was a dramatic acceleration of history. The Soviet Union, already straining under economic failure and political upheaval, could no longer sustain the pretense of superpower parity. The military pillar of its empire was shown to be made of clay. In December 1991, less than 11 months after the conclusion of Desert Storm, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The Cold War was over, and its end had been bookended by 2 conflicts: the Soviet quagmire in Afghanistan that exposed its systemic weaknesses, and the American-led coalition's dazzling victory in the Gulf that showcased the new paradigm's devastating strength. The United States emerged as the world's sole military hyperpower, its doctrine and technology without peer. Military and its allied forces, the victory validated what came to be known as the Revolution in Military Affairs, RMA. AirLand Battle was seen as the doctrinal blueprint of this revolution. The core tenets, precision strike, information dominance, jointness, and rapid decentralized maneuver, were enshrined as gospel. The conflict spurred a relentless push toward a fully digitized battlefield. The lessons learned were codified into new weapons systems, the command and control architectures that would enable network-centric warfare, the further development of stealth, the B-2 bomber, F-22 Raptor, and a whole generation of precision munitions. Warfare had shifted irreversibly from an industrial age model of mass and attrition to an information age model of knowledge and effects. This unipolar moment, however, sowed the seeds of future complexity. Defense establishment. The belief took hold that future conflicts would mirror this clean, decisive, conventional model. The messy, human-centric realities of counterinsurgency, so starkly evident in the Soviet-Afghan experience, were relegated to a lesser passing category of military operations other than war, MOOTW. The focus remained on refining the tools to defeat a peer adversary that, after 1991, no longer existed. The military optimized itself for the last war, a war it had won perfectly, creating a potential blind spot for the very different challenges that lay ahead in the coming century. The long-term consequences of this doctrinal clash and its desert resolution rippled through the following decades, shaping wars, empires, and insurgencies in often unintended ways. The first and most direct blowback was the empowerment of a new, non-state threat. The very same network of veteran mujahideen, Arab volunteers and their CIA, ISI patrons that had helped unravel the Soviet system in Afghanistan now gazed upon a new superpower presence in the Arabian Peninsula. Troops in Saudi Arabia after Desert Storm was the ultimate provocation, a desecration of Holy Land by the same power that had just demonstrated its overwhelming might. The success against the Soviets had bred a generation of fighters who believed that with sufficient faith and resilience, even a superpower could be bled and defeated. The United States, in showcasing its mastery of conventional warfare, inadvertently redirected the focus of global jihad onto itself. The seeds for September 11, 2001 were watered in the aftermath of both the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan and the American triumph in the Gulf. For the Russian military that emerged from the USSR's collapse, the 1990s were a period of profound humiliation and introspection, dominated by the twin specters of Afghanistan and Desert Storm. The Chechen Wars, 1994 to 1996, 1999, 2009, became their painful laboratory for adaptation. Initially, the Russian military attempted to apply the blunt, artillery-heavy tactics of its Afghan and Soviet past to Grozny in 1994, resulting in catastrophic losses and a stunning defeat at the hands of Chechen guerrillas. It was a grim echo of past failures. The lessons, however, were slowly and brutally absorbed. By the Second Chechen War, a more pragmatic, flexible approach emerged. Greater use of special forces, Spetsnaz, improved coordination between ground units and air power, and the leveraging of loyal local proxies. This was not an adoption of AirLand Battle, but a grim Russian evolution towards what they termed hybrid warfare, blending political, informational, and military tools, a path that would later define their operations in Georgia and Ukraine. Military's journey in the post-Gulf War era was one of attempting to replicate its perfect victory, only to find the paradigm did not fit. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom, was in its initial conventional phase, Desert Storm on fast forward. The shock and awe air campaign and the thunderous ground advance to Baghdad were a flawless execution of networked precision warfare against a conventional force. Saddam's army was dismantled in 3 weeks. But this was the climax of the RMA narrative, after which the script was discarded. Military, having spent a decade perfecting its Desert Storm model, was intellectually and materially unprepared. To see and destroy any tank formation in the desert could not identify a lone insurgent planting an IED, nor could it secure the loyalty of a population. The American way of war had to painfully relearn the lessons of counterinsurgency that the Soviets had learned and forgotten a generation prior. The ultimate legacy of this doctrinal shift is visible in the battlefields of the 2020s, the principles born of AirLand Battle, precision, information dominance, jointness, and deep strike have now proliferated and democratized. Monopoly, once studied Soviet deep battle, developing their own doctrine of system destruction warfare aimed at blinding and crippling a networked adversary. Modern conflicts from Nagorno-Karabakh to Ukraine feature the widespread use of drones, precision artillery, and cyber attacks. the tactical and operational tools of the RMA now in the hands of smaller states and even non-state actors. The battlefield has become transparent and lethal in ways the planners of 1991 could scarcely imagine, rendering the massing of forces the central tenet of deep battle, an invitation to annihilation. Thus, the journey that began with a Soviet battalion trapped in a Panjshir ambush culminated in a world where the very concept of concentrated mass, the cornerstone of 20th century warfare, has been fundamentally undermined. The doctrine forged to defeat it now defines the tempo and terror of modern combat, creating a continuum of destruction that stretches from the mountain passes of Afghanistan to the trench lines of the Donbass. The story of deep battle and AirLand battle is more than a tactical comparison. It is a parable of adaptation and intellectual entropy in the machinery of war. The Soviet doctrine, for all its geometric brilliance and historical validation, was a monument to a specific time and place, the Eastern Front of 1944. It became a victim of its own success, fossilized into dogma, unable to comprehend a world where the enemy was not a mirrored army on a linear front. Its failure in Afghanistan was not a failure of courage or material, but of imagination. It revealed that the most dangerous rigidity is not in fortifications, but in thought. AirLand battle, born from defeat in Vietnam and fear of Soviet mass, represented the triumph of a different intellectual tradition, one that valued flexibility, initiative, and the constant integration of new technology, not just as better tools, but as catalysts for new ways of thinking. It succeeded in 1991, not merely because of smart bombs and stealth aircraft, but because it was a cognitive framework designed to exploit the OODA loop, to observe, orient, decide, and act faster and more effectively than an adversary trapped in a slower, more rigid cycle. It targeted the enemy's mind and his model of the world before targeting his tanks. Yet the parable holds a warning within its triumph. No doctrine is timeless. The very completeness of the 1991 victory created its own orthodoxy, its own potential for intellectual trap. The belief that technology and network-centric warfare were the answer risked creating a new kind of rigidity, one ill-suited for the amorphous human puzzles of counterinsurgency and hybrid conflict. The cycle continues. Today's cutting-edge doctrine is tomorrow's historical artifact, vulnerable to the next innovation, the next asymmetric challenge. The true lesson lies not in the specifics of either manual, but in the relentless necessity of critical thought. It is the lesson that the map is never the territory, that the perfect plan is the one that can be abandoned, and that the greatest weapon a military can possess is the capacity to learn, adapt, and think beyond the confines of its own most cherished victories. In the end, the duel between these two doctrines teaches that war is ultimately a contest of intellects, waged not just on fields of fire and metal, but in the quieter realms of idea and adaptation. The generals who understood this shaped history. Those who did not became its prisoners.